Prashant?
Yeah. Can we make it fully screen somehow? Yep, that's perfect. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, and welcome to the webinar number 27 for the Reclaim Network Plus. So this is, the monthly webinar series. And if you don't know about the Reclaim Network, so this is a Network Plus which was funded by the UKRI, so 3 councils, which is the Engineering and Physical Research Council, Natural Environment Research Council, and Arts Humanities Research Council. And there are 5 institutions which are involved in the network. So this is me. My name is Prashant Kumar, and I'm from the University of Surrey as a lead for the network. I've got colleagues from the UKCH, Bangor University, Warwick, University of Bath, and we got our, the network manager and the project officers who are helping to run the, the network there. So it's a multidisciplinary network, and the whole idea of these webinars are to bring in the academic and non-academic, the speakers try to share their experiences about the green and blue infrastructure implementation in urban areas. It has been a very successful series so far. So as I said, this is the webinar number 27. So that means that we have already had 52 speakers over the last year and a half who have spoken about their research at this platform. And today we have the 2 speakers. I will introduce them briefly. But just to also mention that all these webinars are recorded and they go to our YouTube channel, and you can have access to them. So the network has grown quite a lot over the years. So we started the network with almost 0 members. Now we have 620 members, and they represent 45 countries, over 45 countries, and they come from different sectors and with a very different, the diverse kind of interest in the green and blue, the scope. We do a lot of these activities in the Reclaim, the network. Starting with the projects, we funded around £400,000 worth of projects, and they have delivered a fantastic case studies. So we will be talking about them a little bit, in future. There are synthesis reviews, workshops, secondments, and the webinar series, and there was a photographic competition, and we are working on the GBGI database, and there is a continuous dissemination on the LinkedIn and Twitter. So if you are there, you could possibly join us. So, but you can see a lot more details of these activities on our website, which is the reclaim-network.org. Just to kind of, the highlight actually, this month, we had the large event that was a conference in a couple of months ago, and that was a very successful kind of, the event with over 100, the over 100 participants. They bringing actually, the wealth of experience from, the different, sectors like councils, businesses, academia, industry, policymakers. And so this was quite a, so if you wanted to know more a little bit about, the activities, you can go onto the website and you can find more, including the videos, which shows actually everything in 2 or 3 minutes, what happened on the day. So, so without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speakers today. So we got Joe Bradley. She's Director of Operations from Stormwater Shepherds, and Professor Ian Mell, and he's Professor in Environment and Landscape Planning at University of Manchester. So how it works is we got 20 minutes each for each of the speakers. We take all the questions and answers in the end. So I would request you to write your questions and answer questions in using the Q&A box. And you can write your name and the affiliation if you want it to be read with your question. And I'm going to read it actually to the speakers in the end to have an answer to your questions. We this is, as I said, these webinars are recorded, so you will get the link later on if you wanted to share with your colleagues. So just to introduce our first speaker today. So Jo Bradley has worked on many aspects of water management during her 30-year career in the UK. She has worked in a clean water laboratory, been a trade-off effluent officer, overseen drought plan development, and taken endless sewage samples. But her passion lies in pollution prevention and control, and she was a lead author on some of the Environment Agency's pollution prevention guidance notes, which were widely respected and applied. She focused on topics including oil water separator, private sewage treatment systems, and retail profiling. And today she will be talking about the pollution from highway runoff and the opportunities to use green infrastructure. So thank you very much, Jo, and welcome. And the floor is now yours.
Well, mine. Thank you, Prashant. I must apologise for being wet in a strange place. It's a long story, but here I am. Next slide, please, Charlotte. So I work for a charity called, hopefully an image will appear in a minute. That's it. So I work for a charity called Stormwater Shepherds, and we are dedicated to reducing pollution from urban surfaces. So I deal with all sorts of urban pollution and plastic litter, but today we're going to talk about road runoff. Next slide, please. So pollution from highway runoff is what consumes my time and energy all the time at the moment, and has done for some time. We know that it's polluted. I shall talk to you a little bit about that, but I shan't go on about it in detail because we kind of know the answer. We know it's causing pollution. This is a little pipe that comes off the M6 in Cheshire in a place called Lymm and discharges into a little stream called Massey Brook and causes horrific pollution every time it rains. And so this is why I get animated about pollution from highway runoff. Next slide, Charlotte, please. So the important thing to understand is what is in that runoff. So we need to understand what pollutants are in there and what's going on. One of the kind of new sexy pollutants that have only been discovered in the last 5 years are microplastic tire wear particles. And you can see some in that image there. And the problem with microplastic tire wear particles is they are toxic in their own right. So they leach out toxins, but they also carry with them horrific toxins, which I'll mention in a moment, and they convey them down the rivers and out into oceans. So these little particles, thousands of tons of them every year, are washing off our roads and into our rivers and streams and oceans. And there's a lot of research now that's showing that they're causing horrific harm. They go into the bodies of marine organisms. They can pass through into organs. They've been found them in the brains of octopuses, and they have these toxic effects, long-term toxic effects. So they're horrible. And there are also toxic metals in road runoff, which are equally horrible. Copper and zinc are toxic to all sorts of organisms, particularly aquatic organisms. They're bioaccumulative, so they build up in the bodies of the little organisms, and then they're eaten by the fish, and then they're eaten by the kingfisher, and they're eaten by whoever. And those toxic metals build up through the food chain and cause all sorts of toxic effects. And then the thing that I focus most of my attention on is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and they are also horrible. Polyaromatic hydrocarbons are a particularly nasty, insidious pollutant because they cause sublethal harm. So they cause deformities, mutations, cancers. They affect reproduction. They cause abortions. They cause eggs to fail. They cause failure to grow and thrive. So they have a lot of sublethal effects on the population of aquatic organisms. And so together, that highway runoff that I showed you in that previous image, all the pollutants within it are causing really horrific pollution. Next slide, please, Charlotte. I have mentioned there they also cause harm to human health, but there's less research on that. Sorry, I have to wait for the slides to catch up or else I'll lose my train of thought. I've put a link here to this report. I shan't go into detail about the report. It's quite a long report, and it contains lots of results of analysis. It contains a description of the regulatory framework that should control discharges from highway runoff, and it's free to download from that link. Next slide, please, Charlotte. And so these discharges, that highway runoff, that image I showed you at the beginning, there are 25,000 discharges like that off the motorway network in England and Wales, and there are, we think, about 1 million discharges in total off the road network across the UK. So whereas that little outfall I showed you and this outfall in this image here, if you imagine that there are at least 25,000 really bad ones of those, and then 1 million others, the effect on our river environment is huge. And next slide, please, Charlotte. They don't just go into rivers and streams, they also go into the ground. So if you are lucky enough to live near a chalk stream in southern England, then these discharges also go into the chalk. Sometimes there are discharges that go straight into the ground at the side of the road. Is it catching up, Charlotte, or have I failed to remember? That's one. So this image shows a little ditch at the side of the A3M near Portsmouth, if anybody lives down there. And the runoff from the A3M just goes into that ditch. It's held back by those rubber berms, and it soaks into the ground and causes pollution of the chalk aquifer. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Part of the problem with all of this is nobody's measuring it. So the Environment Agency don't measure this pollution, and so it kind of goes under the radar, and the regulatory framework isn't applied to it effectively because nobody's measuring it. If you can't measure it, you can't control it, and there's a lack of monitoring. And so the question, the positive, cheerful question is, what do we do about this? Let's not be all doomy and gloomy. This is a really lovely image of the Sheffield Grey to Green retrofit SUDS scheme in Sheffield City Centre. You can see the car is on the road, and the SUDS device that's in the foreground of that photograph is designed to take that runoff from the road. It literally just goes off the edge of the road and into this green device. The pollutants soak into the soil, they're taken up by the plants, they're broken down by microorganisms and sunshine. And that device also delivers magnificent flood risk management and also a fantastic habitat for wildlife. I was there last week, and it was sunny, and the insect life on that device, a huge device in Sheffield, the whole SUDS device goes all the way down through the city centre and down towards the railway station. Masses of biodiversity in there. Next slide, please, Charlotte. The really important thing to remember about retrofit SUDS like that is that you can only use those for roads that have a low or medium traffic density. The pollutant load can be huge. So off a motorway, the pollutant load can be tons every year of contaminated sediment, and also kilograms every year of toxic metals and significant quantities of toxic organic chemicals. So for low traffic roads and medium traffic roads, some medium traffic roads, these devices that I'm showing in these slides are perfect. So this is another device in a little town called Chorley near my house, and that swale, that's a linear bioswale. The runoff from the road again goes straight over the edge of the road into that linear bioswale. All the treatment happens in the soil horizons and the grass surface. The nutrients are taken up by the growing plants. It gets mowed. That one gets mowed about once a year at the end of the year. And so these devices are fantastic for those low traffic roads like that. Next slide, please, Charlotte. I'll talk a little bit more about maintenance in a minute. And for medium traffic roads, you have to use some site specific information to decide whether or not you can use vegetative devices or manufactured devices. Sorry, I'd forgotten about this photograph. This shows you the new scheme that's been built in Sheffield as we speak. So this is the next phase of devices that are being built in Sheffield. The reason that photograph is useful is it shows that the runoff just comes over the edge of the road. There's no curb, there's no delineation. The water just comes straight into that SUDS device, cascades down through that SUDS device, and once that's planted up, it'll be another beautiful habitat for wildlife. Next slide, please, Charlotte. There are other towns where they've got excellent retrofit SUDS. Cardiff has an excellent example in a place called Grangetown. Llanelli have some, and Enfield are very good at retrofit SUDS. So I've said that those green blue devices are good for low traffic roads and some medium traffic roads. As soon as you go up into the high traffic roads, so trunk roads, motorways, arterial routes, places like that, then you need to have something more chunky and more sort of engineered to deliver the effective treatment. So we always start the treatment design with a sediment capture device. This one in this photograph is called a vortex grit separator, and that is like a Dyson cleaner for stormwater. So the stormwater goes round in circles and the sediment settles out in the bottom. A device like that is fantastic because it'll take away about half of the suspended solids, and with that it will take away a significant amount of the microplastic tire wear particles, the toxic metals and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So for heavily trafficked roads, that should always be your first line of defence, either a vortex grit separator or an oil separator or a sediment trap of some sort. Once we've taken that large proportion of pollutant out, then we can start to think about going back to our green-blue infrastructure. Next slide, please, Charlotte. And there's a point at the bottom there about automatic closure devices. There's also a need for those in the design as well, because sometimes you'll get a spillage on the motorway and you need to have some closure device to protect all these systems. Once you've done that sediment removal in your sediment removal device, the next part of the treatment train will be a pond. Look at that, just appeared as I said it. So this is a pond that's treating road runoff in north of Preston in a little town called Garstang. So there's a sediment removal device upstream of this, so it's already captured some of the sediment to make that runoff a little cleaner. And then this device will do the next step of the pollution control. So you'll get sedimentation of the smaller particles. The activity of the sunshine will break down some of the organic pollutants. Lots and lots of microorganic activity in there, breaking down organic pollutants. But you've also got plant growth and microorganic plant growth, so that you're capturing a lot of the nutrients that are in that runoff. So if you have a device like this, you'll take away another significant proportion of pollution from that road runoff before it goes on into the water environment. So green blue solutions like this can be excellent, but you do need to have that pre-treatment first to prevent these from becoming sort of toxic habitats. Next slide, please, Charlotte. It does depend a little bit depends a lot on the traffic density and the level of pollution, and that one is a road that's a medium risk road, so it handles that pond handles that runoff beautifully. Whatever you do, this is another type of sediment capture device. This is a sediment capture separator. Whatever you do in your design, whether you have a vortex separator or a swale or a bioremediation zone like the one at Sheffield, or a pond, you have to maintain them. So I've recently visited some SUDs, in fact this week, visited some SUDs in Enfield that just are a bit short of maintenance. So you start to see failures of the inlet device, you start to see failures of the plant growth, which matters because these green blue infrastructure devices need to be attractive and aesthetically pleasing, or people will start to say they don't want them. But also you've got to maintain these devices because you're capturing toxic pollution. We're not just talking about organic pollution or leaf matter, we're talking about toxic pollutants. And so it's really important that when you capture them in a device like this one, you then maintain and operate that device in perpetuity. And I say a lot to people, so some of these schemes, this one for example, you can be talking about £1 million for installing some of these devices and then building a big pond. And it's madness to build a device that's cost you £1 million and then not to include a revenue budget for your revenue. So there's a definite need for better long-term planning for retrofit and indeed new build green blue infrastructure schemes for highway runoff. It's all good and well finding the capital costs, but you also need to find your revenue costs. Next slide, please, Charlotte. And in fact, I've just been in a meeting this morning with a journalist who's interested in the failure to maintain ponds around the M25. So New Civil Engineer have been writing some articles about that recently. And they've got these huge multi-million pound ponds all the way around the M25, but there hasn't been any maintenance of them some of them for 40 years. So they're not working properly anymore. And hopefully the next slide will come up shortly, because I've got two images to show you of the sort of sediment and waste that we take out of these devices and how effective they can be in protecting the environment. We'll sit with bated breath now. We wait for the image to pop up. I apologise, I'm having to work remotely today. Circumstances out of my control. Charlotte's pulling a face. Has it gone wrong, Charlotte?
No, it's working on my end, so I don't know why it's not showing up.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you. So these two images. So the one on the left is sediment that we've taken out of a vortex grit separator in Wigan in Lancashire, and then this is at the treatment plant. So this is the first stage of treatment. So they dewater it and then they put it through treatment processes. The reason I think this image is really powerful is because when I talk to people about pollution from road runoff and stopping the pollution going in the river, that would have gone in the river if we hadn't have installed that vortex grit separator. And that's one outfall off one road in Wigan. And we think there are 1 million of these outfalls. So if you imagine every time it rains, and obviously we've all had quite, or a lot of us have had really heavy rain in the last few days, every time it rains, sediment like that, which is full of toxins, washes off our roads and highways straight into the river. Now that was we removed about 4 tonnes on that event from one device on one outfall. And so if you multiply that up across the country, this is a massive source of pollution. But you need to bear that in mind when you're designing your green blue infrastructure devices, because you need to capture that before it goes into your pond or your swale or your basin. And the image on the right is an oil water separator, so the big blue one that you saw, something like that, and that's just before it's been emptied. And the reason I use that image is to remind people that these devices work. I get criticised sometimes for saying let's have manufactured devices upstream of our green blue infrastructure, but this is why I advocate for them, because this is what they do. They capture this gunge, this toxic gunge, before it goes into the water environment. Hopefully it's the last slide now, Charlotte, and we can stop falling out with the machine. So I think the last slide is just my contact details. The report I'd included on the earlier slide with the link is a really detailed report describing all of this problem. I've got there's some results from analysis in there that show you the analysis of the runoff that we've taken, but also it lays out the regulatory framework and how this pollution should be controlled and monitored. And it describes some recommendations that I made along with SciWem, if you're familiar with SciWem. Oh, sorry, there's a slide there just to say we can do this. So we have, and in fact I was at a meeting last night with a group of engineers in London. We have engineers in this country who are very good at designing these schemes. We have manufacturers who manufacture the devices to capture the pollution, and we have experts in the world of green blue infrastructure design. So we can absolutely do this. We need a big bag of money from somewhere, because it's going to cost a lot of money, and that's what I'm working on, is trying to influence people who have access to the funds. And this image, just to finish, is this is on the Congleton bypass, if anybody's living in Cheshire, and this is a new road scheme that was built I think a couple of years ago, and the design engineer has included separation devices and then this big pond and a closure device, which is really nice to see on the outlet from the pond. So if there was a spillage on the road, you could close that closure device. And so we can do these designs. We're very good at them. We just need to get on and do a whole lot more, and a whole lot more quickly. And then I promise that the last slide really is my contact details. But feel free to give me a shout if you'd like to talk about this in more detail. It is my area of passion, and I'm happy to talk about it with anybody who's interested. Hopefully, anyway, there is a slide with when you get the slides, you'll see there's a slide with my contact details on it. Thank you. I'm sorry it was a bit clunky.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. I would request actually the colleagues on this webinar just to write your questions for Jo using the Q&A box. So I would like to now introduce to our second speaker, Professor Ian Mell, who is a professor in environmental and landscape planning at the University of Manchester. His teaching and research focusing on comparative analysis of the development of green infrastructure and its economic, social, cultural, and economic value to society, and include discussions of temporality, spatial difference, and disciplinary variation in approach. Ian has extensive experience of working in and with local and international government to develop planning policy and urban greening projects, most notably the National Green Infrastructure Standard that was published by DAFRA and Natural England in 2023. He is the author of Global Green Infrastructure and the upcoming Growing Green Infrastructure in Contemporary Asian Cities book that will be published very soon by Routledge. Without any further ado, so I'd like to invite Professor Mell Professor Mell, sorry, my apologies, to take the floor for the next 20 minutes. Ian?
Oh, have we lost them?
Is my screen there, Charlotte?
Yes, we can
Yeah.
see you and hear you, or we can see and hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for the interest in this work. I mean, it's always nice to hear from people who are actually doing these things. So I think Jo's presentation is very much here's how you do it in practice, and mine's more about here's how you might think about some of these ideas. And so the joke I often make is now for something completely different. But I think a lot of what Joe talked about is really important when we think more internationally about some of these ideas, particularly around capital versus maintenance cost. We can build really cool stuff, but can we maintain them? What are we trying to do with green or blue infrastructure? What are we trying to deliver? What change are we trying to see? Who are we trying to deliver these benefits for, and how do we try and look at that in the long term? So I think what we see a lot when we're looking at international examples of green or green and blue infrastructure is something that Joe really talked about, is that knowledge exchange and that knowledge transfer. How do we learn from each other? How do we take what works in the UK and apply it to other parts of Europe? How do we take what might work in parts of Southern Europe and apply those to different parts of the world, particularly Asia? And so what I'm going to talk through today is just some work that I've been involved with recently, looking at the ways in which cities in China, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore are trying to react to really complicated urban problems around climate change, biodiversity loss, health and well-being, quality of place, and trying to look at how they utilise their environment more effectively. And I think this is a really critical issue, because having spent quite a lot of time in Hong Kong and China last year, the impact of typhoons is becoming increasingly problematic for urban infrastructure in terms of its functionality over the long term. And indeed, many cities around the area are starting to feel that redundancy that we see with concrete, that it has a lifespan, and a lot of what they're doing is now coming to an end. But I think one thing that we have to be aware of in the area is the way in which culture plays a significant role in the way in which we conceive green or blue infrastructure, and the way in which we might consider history in terms of design features, of density of a location, of green spaces, is somewhat different to how we might see some of the megacities of China, for example, now. So how do the classic gardens of Suzhou fit with the big international GI projects in Shanghai, for example? And how does somewhere like Hong Kong, where the density of the city means all space is incredibly economically valuable, how do you try and fit in there new forms of GI that are going to improve people's quality of life and quality of place? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk through is a combination of signposting of historical ideas, the ways in which countries have looked to the past to have that level of continuity around what kind of design they might wish to have, how we might look at the politics of urban development and urban management in contemporary Asian cities and how that shapes what is built. Are we simply building more and upwards, or are we thinking about land use in a more ecological way? And I think we also need to think about the ways in which people use spaces in East and Southeast Asia, because as somebody born and raised in the UK, having spent a lot of time outside the UK, I still find it fascinating the cultural variation in terms of how parks are used. And the image there on the far left from Suzhou Park it's an image close to my heart. That was the first time I was in China in 2015, and there was a little lady with her afternoon karaoke and her entourage all enjoying her singing, and it was just a very different experience of park use than you might find in the UK, for example. So I think being aware of all these different forms, functions, benefits and beneficiaries is something that we need to take into consideration when we're looking at how we develop cities for the future. And so because of that, when we're thinking about green infrastructure, I think the word mediation is really important. We're mediating between quite complicated economic, social, cultural, and personal understandings of place. And that means there's a need for negotiation, compromise. We need to understand where our cities have come from and where they're going into the future. And the fact that we're dealing with different problems to what we were 100 years ago. We're still thinking about economic growth, but we're now thinking about climate change. We're now thinking about the way in which cities need to be resilient to more extreme weather, be it flooding, urban heat, typhoons, and so on. We also need to think about the ways in which people interact with those everyday spaces around them. So be it their garden, if they're lucky enough to have one, or their street greening, or their local park. and how that might then escalate up into a network of spaces across a city. But also we need to think carefully about the ways in which green space, in particular in urban areas, has a very strong link to politics, money and power. So particularly in somewhere like Japan, where the Shogun and the Edo era parks were all about people owning that space and having the money to create these gardens, which were heavily manicured and managed, because they show that their power over the landscape was there, and whether or not we need to move away from that pristine management of landscape into something that's a little bit more diverse. So I think one of the interesting things that we see in this particular geographical region is the complexity of trying to find a singular answer to what is in fact a very nuanced and bespoke set of ideas, which are different depending on where we are. And so these ideas of tradition versus contemporary design, issues of density, form and function. So where do we see green infrastructure? What is it doing, and what does it make us feel? So the few examples from the left there from Beijing, the redevelopment of a new park underneath the Fourth Ring Road, because it's a space that isn't otherwise used, to make a very small, quiet, tranquil park, compared to the ginkgo street trees at Tsinghua University and their use as a social media, WeChat, TikTok sort of place that people go and almost get run over constantly because they're in the road, but actually they want to have that picture for their social media. And then if you move to somewhere in Tokyo, in Hong Kong, where height and depth are becoming increasingly important, how do you green the steps on Hong Kong Island? How do you try and green back alleys to make them more usable for the public, rather than just being dense, really hot urban canyons? So there are ways in which we can try and look to the past for certain landscape motifs. And I think specifically in China and in Japan, this is something that is quite easily seen. But also to think about how we look at current form in terms of what are we trying to do with our urban areas? Who are we trying to deliver them for? And what functions or benefits are we talking about? And part of that is to think about urban green infrastructure as a form of regeneration, of renewal, of repurposing of infrastructure which might become redundant. And I think this is increasingly important in cities where you had that post-Second World War boom in terms of both the spatial scale, but also the intensification of urban infrastructure, be it around transport, industry or housing. And what we see, and these are all examples from Seoul in South Korea, is that concrete has now come to its end of its shelf life. So what do we do with it? Do we break it down and remove it and build new things, which is incredibly expensive and incredibly bad in terms of carbon? Or do we try and repurpose these places into public greenways or public green and blue spaces? And so I think here we can start to see that with contemporary discussions of green infrastructure, we're looking at a rekindling of a value within urban environments for nature. We're bringing nature and landscape back into urban areas as a prestige location, almost as something which is interactive and connective and multifunctional, and something which can deliver a whole host of different ecological, social and economic benefits. But then we have to think carefully about how this happens in different places. And so just to go through a series of almost vignettes really of the way in which different countries approach green infrastructure. We have now, we'll talk about China, Japan, then Singapore and South Korea. And I think what's interesting is that each of these locations has a very strong relationship with urban nature, with urban water systems, and with the way in which parks or street greening have a very strong cultural value. But the application of this and the management of this differs significantly depending on where we are. And I think part of that is a reflection of the politics of development, but also it's a reflection on where value is placed on nature by different parts of a community, be they government officials, be they politicians, be they local communities, developers, the environment sector, and so on. And I think China is a very interesting place to start, because if you go to, I would say, most Chinese cities, and certainly ones that I've been to, there's a very strong relationship between the value allocated to historical parks or places. So the picture in the top left there is the Summer Palace from Beijing. And that was a Wednesday morning, or might be a Wednesday afternoon in November, and there were thousands of people there. So people go there to have that history and that culture. But then you also have things like the Olympic Park in Beijing. Again, the same day, less people, but people still there. And so there is this link between people wanting to understand and appreciate and take that knowledge of the past and that heritage and that history within your personal or your national identity, and see how that can be mapped onto new things. And so I think one way that this has happened is that in China specifically is this constant recycling of ideas from both other places around the world, but also from within China to have these series of different national policies, be it garden cities, healthy cities, eco-towns, eco-cities, forest cities, so on and so forth. And what we see here is that the Chinese government has a 5-year cycle, really, of developing new policy which is geared towards a particular aspect of green infrastructure. And it might be around ecological functionality, net zero. It might be around a certain element, so be it forest or sustainable urban drainage with sponge cities. And they're trying to find a way to create a program of investment which is meaningful and long term. And I think what is particularly interesting in China is that there's been a lack of tenure over each of these particular policies. They've constantly been recycled every 4 or 5 years, with the exception of sponge cities, which now have been around for 10 years, and they seem to have taken a real purchase in both the national planning policy of China, but also in terms of a global conversation around sustainable water management and sustainable drainage design. And I'd like to thank Caroline Wang, who helped with some of the research here in Wuhan about sponge cities, because it's really interesting to get a local perspective on what's happening. And so China really has gone with the what's the new thing? What's the new thing? What else can we learn? What additional information can we bring in to help develop our cities? But then it's therefore start to export from city ideas as they've taken a real purchase in terms of planning for water. Now, if we compare that to Japan, we can see a whole different set of ideas being used to frame green infrastructure development. Some are comparable, so the availability of land, the cost of developing green space compared to apartment buildings or commercial infrastructure. But there does seem to be a greater reverence placed on more traditional forms of GI, particularly things like the Toji Gate at the top, the Toji Gates in the top right there, and the ways in which that reverence for culture and for religion comes through in what's being presented within Japanese GI. But I think balancing that is also a very interesting approach to looking at more contemporary high quality design, which is geared around biodiversity maintenance, water management, climate change adaptation, to really create spaces in urban areas which are both meaningful and functional for different people. And I'd add to that if you look at any sort of spatial maps of Japanese city, and these are all images from Kyoto and from Tokyo, you see that there's a very visible awareness of the role of networks being used. So particularly water networks. So in Kyoto, both of the city's river, which sort of encompass the city centre, are used as greenways. And the picture there on the top left is part of between a 12 and 16 kilometre greenway that is a multimodal path for people to walk and cycle across the eastern part of the city. But what it also works at is a flood mitigation area. So when the city floods, it can actually hold the water there. And it also works as a refuge for disaster events, so be it earthquakes. So that they're starting to look at nature and greenways and green infrastructure as a form of multifunctional space that has to deliver a whole series of different ideas for the city. And again, the picture on the bottom right is a linear greenway along one of the rivers in Tokyo, a bit more old-fashioned, a bit more concrete, but actually there are these points where nature is interspersed with it to make them a little bit greener and to offer that bit of respite. So I think Japan is very interested in innovation in terms of doing things differently, but also being responsive to the culture that it knows. If we move further forward and think about Singapore and South Korea, I think this changes slightly, and I think we have to be aware that there's a much greater level of political influence on what's going on here. So post-independence from first the British, then and then Malaysia, Singapore has had a whole series of national GI policies, of national GI programs based around street tree interventions, water management, the green concept plans, and more recently the move to being a city in a garden. And I think what's interesting here is the way in which Lee Kuan Yew has really tried to shape the way in which innovation and technology can be used to show what green infrastructure can do. Things like the Gardens by the Bay project being probably the most visible example, but also the fact that they've looked at the ways in which particular locations can be used to address a whole series of different things. So the Bishangang Mokyo Park used to be a 25-metre wide drainage basin and is now one of the really adaptable multifunctional parks in the centre of Singapore, which offers this access for young kids to a water body which they might otherwise not have had. So I think in Singapore it's interesting where they've managed to marry these international expertise and that willingness to bring in expert knowledge to shape some of their ideas with an understanding that the country has limited natural resources, so it has to think quite carefully about managing those, and therefore is looking at connectivity, of multifunctionality, of the future and future-proofing the city to be more resilient to firstly climate change, but also things like water scarcity, because although it rains quite a lot in Singapore, it's also quite dry for a lot of the year as well. So I think Singapore is interesting in that it's taken the view of looking externally and then maximising that knowledge around water and biodiversity and climate to create new and more innovatively and potentially world-leading projects. And I think South Korea follows a similar sort of approach with Lee Yuan-bak, the former mayor of Seoul and then Prime Minister of South Korea, looking at GI as a transformative tool, so looking at it as a form of regeneration, almost akin to what we saw in Germany in the Ruhr with the Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord, or the community forest in the northeast and the northwest of England. And it's looking at that reshaping of public infrastructure into something more interactive, something more multifunctional, climate resilient, rather than just being large swathes of concrete. And I think within this, there's that notion that political power and political will has been incredibly important at driving forward the ability to invest in nature in very high density and economically marginal locations in terms of why invest in nature rather than investing in their infrastructure. And I think what we've seen is a positivity in terms of the ways in which nature can be used to address individual, community and societal problems. So thinking about mobility, access to nature, climate adaptation, but also it's led to a level of conversation around this services as well. So have each of these projects led to gentrification? Are they leading to a negative return on investments for the city? And if so, was there a level of consultation about what they were or not going to do? But I think South Korea has been incredibly good at using nature and using green infrastructure as a really strong tool to try and to progress their greening agenda, because they know that it's a direct response to infrastructure redundancy. And so if we take the area as a whole, and I'm aware that we haven't covered the whole of Southeast Asia, this little bit yet, but we have these variety of economic and political drivers, these ideas around form, function and design, the cultural norms that we see in each of these locations, and these climatic and ecological drivers. And I think what we have is a bit of a buffet, really, a bit of a pick and mix, where you could take each of these 12 different ideas here and formulate them in a different way to think about how cities in China or cities in Hong Kong or cities in Japan actually look at the environment. And I think what's interesting is that where there's strong political will, where there's good design, where there's a responsiveness to density and availability of space, and where things are both culturally and climatically and economically responsive, we start to see more effective and long-term investment in GI that is responsive to what's actually needed. And so just to wrap up is that I think in this region that GI is incredibly idiosyncratic. It's very bespoke to individual locations. And depending on where you are, who's involved, which politicians, be it the national government or local politicians, there's a way of investing in GI which allows you to be big and bold and also responsive to local needs. There is this view that we have to think about what are the different services or functions that we're delivering with GI and how that fits within for different audiences, be it for individuals and communities, be it for society, be it for economic development specialists, or be it for the environment sector. And that we have to think carefully about the redundancy we see in infrastructure in Asian cities, particularly around concrete and around building redundancy. So therefore, can GI be a successful regenerative tool? And if so, how does that then react to things like climate change? And I think within all this, there is a reflectiveness on tradition and what types of design and what types of place people want. But overall, that GI development in this area is not simple, it's complicated. And it's not universally the same, although we can compare and contrast and find similar ideas. And if you are interested in this, just a little plug for the book that it's hot off the press in a couple of weeks' time. So if anybody's interested in it, I'm more than happy to provide some more information. So thank you once again for the invitation. I'm sorry I've run over a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting presentation and very complimentary to the previous one. As you rightly said, that the previous one was more on hands-on in what can be done or what is being done, and you very rightly highlighted the need and how you can think about and you can plan the cities. I think this is an opportunity for the colleagues on the call to ask questions from Joe and Ian. To start with, I've got a question for Joe. It says it's from Tom Palmer, and he has asked the question: given the high concentration of metals in highway runoff, are any companies extracting them for reuse? If not, do you see this as a viable activity?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. There have been research programs in the past where people have looked at this, and there's been a little bit of interest, but it's never been enough to drive a full-scale metal reclamation from the sediment in highway runoff. There's a little move at the moment because there's palladium and platinum in. There's another metal, I can't remember its name. Anyway, the palladium and platinum in the sediment in road runoff as well, and apparently they're particularly valuable at the moment. So there is a little bit of work at the moment. Somebody's doing some research measuring that, but it's tricky, because if you take that waste and you take out a little bit of palladium and a little bit of platinum, you're still left with this horrible waste. So nobody wants to take that responsibility. But I think copper, there's a massive amount of copper in road runoff, and I think there's possibly an opportunity in the future. And there's also a huge amount of aluminium. So as the value of those metals change, it may become more viable in the future. But yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So I've got a couple of more questions here, but before I go on to them, Joe, I just wanted to know, I mean, this is quite an interesting concept to secure basically the pollution before it spreads. But who are basically liable to do this job? Is this the Highways Authority, or is this the the local councils, or the local, the public or the communities? Who are basically mainly liable to run these facilities?
It depends on the road. So for what they call the strategic road network, which is motorways, trunk roads, and some arterial routes, that's national highways. So they're absolutely responsible for those. For local authority roads, then it's the local authority. And there are some situations, in fact, quite a lot of situations, where the water company actually conveys this pollution into the water environment. They would argue it's not their pollution. I would argue that they're liable because they're conveying it into the water environment. So there's a little bit of complexity around the water company ones. I noticed Charlotte's dropped a question in as well about the car manufacturers. So also there's an argument that the liability actually sits with us as car drivers. And so there should be a mechanism for car drivers to pay for this treatment. So a tax on tyres, or a tax on fuel, or a tax on brake pads, or all of those. so that generated money to pay for this treatment. But then there is also an argument that the manufacturers have a responsibility as well. So perhaps the people who manufacture the brake pads and the tyres and the fuel oils in the cars should pay a levy of some sort to pay for the treatment of this polluted road runoff. It's a hot potato and nobody's got the answer yet.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question for Ian. Are there any examples of GA projects in the UK that have been copied or inspired from the ones in Asia?
I don't think so. I think what we see is a sharing of information or a sharing of expertise. So I think it's more likely that we get landscape architects, planning developers, that kind of expertise who are working internationally. So your Arabs of the world, where they have footholds in all these major cities. And I think they're the people who are translating local culture into these bigger projects. I think in one way, there's quite a closed look in certain Asian cities around doing the Asian thing, doing what they think is best. And I think doesn't export as easily. Whereas I think if you are a city looking for the next big wow thing, you look to the High Line, you look to these other international things, you go, let's do that. So I think it's more, we're getting that way. I think there's a lot more people working in industry now who have been trained or have worked extensively in both the UK, Western Europe and North America, but also in Japan, South Korea and China, where they're bringing those ideas back. But I don't think there are any particular examples yet where some of the motifs we might see in Chinese landscape architecture have started to permeate into the West yet. So the notions of access to nature, multifunctionality, connectivity between people and place, I think are common across all those places.
Yeah, thank you. If any of the colleagues have got any questions, can you please drop those using the Q&A box? In the meantime, so Ian, I think we have been kind of driving this agenda for a while. The Reclaim Network Plus is being quite instrumental in thinking about the multi benefits and so on. But when it comes to the implementation, so what are the key barriers actually you see, in your opinion, that hinders actually becoming the grey environment into the ideal green and blue environments?
I would say everything that Joe said. I think there is a conversation about money, both capital investment and revenue for maintenance, the availability of space. I think there's a reluctance to try something new in case it goes wrong, because particularly if you're a public official and you're going to get pulled apart by the local press or local communities for wasting public finance, I think people are reluctant there. I think a lot of the technology, despite the fact that we've known about them for many years, I mean, effective water management is not a new idea. It's just been rebadged and reshaped. So I think there's people who don't necessarily appreciate just what we can do and how we can do it. So I think one thing where we are seeing a lot of benefits to this is where you have the big EU projects where you've got cities and SMEs and universities and the environment sector all working together. So Urban Green up in Liverpool, Grow Green in Manchester, the ones that I know best. And you're having those conversations about what is it that makes it easier to explain to a community why this sustainable drainage system is important? Or what is it about this tech company that this sensor is going to be really useful for the long-term management? And so I think there's the usual things, money, political power, willingness to do something, availability of space, knowledge. But I think we've got a whole catalogue, a canon really of examples showing how we can do this. And the ones that you mentioned, Joe, Greater Green, Greener Grangetown, I teach those. I'm glad my mind's in the right place and doing the right things, but I think it's sharing that knowledge, I think, is part of it, and explain to people that it's not as difficult as they might think it is, although it is really difficult.
All right, chip in there, Prashant. There's another, one of the other barriers is that local people don't always want it because they don't trust the councils to look after them. So, and you can kind of, as part of you that can understand that. So they say to the councils, well, you don't sweep the road, you don't collect the litter, you don't look after dog muck and those things. So we don't trust you then to maintain this green device so that it continues to look beautiful. And that causes a reluctance sometimes. And the other problem that we find, particularly in cities like London, is that every time you think you want to do one of these schemes, there's a gas main or a high-powered electric cable or a fibre optic duct or something under the pavement where you want to work, and that can cause conflict as well. So there are barriers, but we're getting much better at overcoming them.
Yeah, so Ian, you made a very good point in terms of showing the trust on a particular, let's say, GI solution, and the investment of public money is in the right direction, because as you said, it is the case actually that the public authorities are worried or scared that they are taking decisions and they are not backed up by the public. And there is one very good example of that is the hedges around the roadsides. So we basically started the research in 2017 and published quite a lot of work, and the evidence base were clearly showing that that can reduce the concentrations by X% or Y%, and that basically went on, and now it become norm actually. So when people are talking about putting the hedges around the schools on the roadsides, nobody basically argue that, oh, this is not the good solution. So I think you are right, but I think in the process, I believe one of these the gaps actually we still have is the real understanding of the positive impact or the positive multi-benefits of this green and blue infrastructure. So a lot of knowledge is based on the expert judgment, but there is still a lack actually in terms of what are the quantitative evidence actually to prove or to back those evidence base. So yeah, thank you.
I think that's quite difficult, isn't it? Because when you're talking to DEFRA or Natural England or the Environment Agency, they want a quantitative number. They want a discharge change. They want a pollutant removal. But when you talk to, I'm a parent, when you talk to a parent about their kids, you have to come from a different angle. So it's kind of, well, what is it about making your kids' environment better? What is it about you being able to go for a walk? What is it about you having some peace and quiet? And I think that there's sometimes that tension, isn't there, between having to have the number for the people who are paying for it, but then having the understanding of what makes it better for people. And I think there's that need for a balance of understanding what people actually respond to, because we've done work in Manchester and people say, oh, I hate trees. It's like, why do you hate trees? And they go, oh, because the birds poos on my car. It's like, well, then get rid of your car is the simple answer. But it's like, okay, but then is it about a certain type of tree? And rather than just trees are bad, it's like it's a very personal thing. So I think we have to just be careful not to go too far either way, because the numbers are great and they get us to do things, but then also people have to be able to buy into it. And I think responding to what they actually might like is something that we need to be careful of as well.
Yeah. So just for the interest and close these discussions for the colleagues on the call, that we have got a synthesis reviews series of the Reclaim Network Plus. So we have been looking into the quantitative evidence of the green and blue infrastructure in terms of the air pollution, urban heating, water runoff, carbon sequestration, noise, and health and well-being. So in fact, we published the first part of it on the urban overheating. So that has been out. If people are interested, we can put the link in the chat box. There's one on the air pollution, which is under review. And then the series of these other papers are currently being almost ready, getting ready actually for submission. So the whole idea is again to look into what kind of evidences do exist and where are the gaps actually there, so that it can align the thinking in future to fill those gaps via the research. So I think I will try to close this because we are just 1 minute away. But before we do that, I think I would like to thank both our speakers for the fantastic presentations and taking their time off from their busy schedule. So thank you very much, everyone. So we can the clap at the end. We are not in person there. Before we close, it looks to me that the next webinar is going to be on 4th of September. And it looks to me that it's me, one of those speakers. I didn't realize that it's me. And we got another colleague actually, who is also the co-investigator from the Reclaim Network Plus, and his expertise are in the water area. So you will hear more about the green infrastructure and the catchment scale benefits in the next kind of webinar. Before we close, if you have any, if you are not the member of the network, you can join the network for free. Just go on to the reclaim-network.org, and there is a link there on the page. You can join it. You can start getting the newsletters, and that will allow us to also tap onto the opportunities which are being generated through the network. And if you want to be a speaker on the forthcoming webinars, you can drop an email to us on info@reclaim-network.org. So we are monitoring this network, and if you're on LinkedIn and Twitter, which is called X, you can follow us and you can know more about our activities. So with that, I would like to thank everyone, including our speakers and the people who have been running and helping in the background, Charlotte, Mark, Sisay, and the audience actually for taking their time and attending this webinar. So we will have the recording updated at some point on the YouTube, and you'll get a link if you wanted to watch it again or share with your colleagues. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye.